Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. On December 20th to December 22nd, 2019 was the Reviving the Islamic Spirit conference in Toronto, Canada at the Metro Convention Centre, downtown Toronto. This conference, mashallah, draws thousands of Muslims to the convention center, most of them very young, university-aged, college-aged, high school-aged, young university graduates, and so forth. Now, every time Muslims come together to do something positive, you can count on the opponents, you can count on the enemies of Islam to be angry and to be upset. So it's not surprising that every year at RIS, outside of the convention center, you will find protesters and people like this. The same three groups come every year. You always have representation from the right-wing media outlet called Rebel Media, which is run by Ezra Levant. There's usually some kind of evangelical Christian presence or Christian protesters outside of the center. And of course, you have the Qadianis or the Ahmadiyya who are also there, again, not happy in their hearts. They're upset that so many Muslims are coming together, that Islam is being taught, that Islam is being revived, the Islamic spirit is being revived. So this year, as usual, there was representation from Rebel Media. David Menzies, who is a reporter for this media outlet, was there. And let's just see what he has to say.
David Menzies for the Rebel News here in downtown Toronto. Well, folks, I'm standing outside the Metro Toronto Convention Centre, which this weekend is host to Canada's largest Islamic conference. It's known as Reviving the Islamic Spirit. And the thing is, when one looks over the roster of speakers up from the United States, a very disturbing pattern emerges when it comes to their views on homosexuals, women, and Jews.
Now after this, David Menzies takes special interest in three of the speakers, Yasir Qadi, Imam Siraj Wahaj, and Sheikh Omar Suleiman. So because I want to keep this video short and I just want to kind of expose the hypocrisy of Rebel News Media and the inconsistency of Rebel News Media, I'm just going to use the last example, which is that of Sheikh Omar Suleiman. Let's see what David Menzies has to say about him.
But wait, folks, there's more. Such as Omar Suleiman, who has expressed some eyebrow-raising viewpoints when it comes to homosexuality and women. For example, Mr. Suleiman has been condemned by moderate Muslim activists for describing homosexuality as a disease and as a, quote, repugnant, shameless sin, end quote. Remember back in October when feminist Megan Murphy gave a speech at a Toronto library? Well, she was condemned solely for having a contrary viewpoint to the PC-approved counting of transgenderism.
David Menzies' point here is that when Megan Murphy, a feminist, spoke at a Toronto Public Library, because she has views that go against transgender rights, left-wing liberal protesters were there outside of the library protesting against her views against transgenderism. But in the case of the RIS convention, there were no left-wing protesters outside of the convention center, that is true, that were protesting against the Muslim speakers who have anti-homosexual views, anti-gay views. And so what David Menzies says sounds very, very reasonable. He says we should have a consistent standard. If left-wing liberals are going to condemn Megan Murphy for her anti-transgender views, those same left-wing liberal protesters should also protest against not just these Muslim speakers, really against any Muslim speaker, because all Muslims believe that homosexuality is wrong. All Muslims, all true Muslims believe in what the Quran teaches, and the Quran teaches that homosexuality is a sin. It is a transgression of God's laws. So on the face level of it, what David Menzies says sounds quite reasonable. I might even agree with him. I might agree that left-wing liberals, if I was a non-Muslim left-wing liberal who is supporting gay rights and transgender rights, why should I only focus on right-wing white nationalist types who might have anti-homosexual views? Why don't I equally focus on Muslims who have anti-homosexual views as well too? But the problem here is that David Menzies himself is being inconsistent, because his media outlet Rebel News will never ever attack or criticize a white Christian leader when they have anti-homosexual or anti-gay views. So for example, the people at Rebel News Media are good friends with Charles McVety. Charles McVety is the president of the Canada Bible College. He's a right-wing, fundamentalist, evangelical Christian. And what do you think his views about homosexuality are going to be? He believes that homosexuality is wrong. This is what Charles McVety has said about homosexualities in the past. He said that they have an insatiable appetite for sex, especially with young people. And there are not enough of them, so they want to proselytize your children and mine, our grandchildren, and turn them into homosexuals. They've seized our Ministry of Education, and now they're implementing this. This is a common theme that Charles McVety repeated when he used to come on the CTS Christian television network. The idea that gays are constantly grooming young boys, that they want to legalize sex with young boys. He has said in the past that Ontario's new sex education curriculum wants to legalize sex between homosexual men and children, between homosexual men and young boys. So this is an allegation that he's made against gays, and this has led to a decision by the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, which resulted in the suspension of the show that Charles McVety was appearing on. The National Post, which is one of our large nationwide newspapers here in Canada, reported the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, a self-regulated industry watchdog, said that Reverend McVety disparaged gays in episodes that ran between July 2009 and February 2010, when commenting on Toronto's massive gay pride parade and a revised Ontario sex curriculum for grade schools. So my point is that it's very hypocritical that as David Menzies decries the inconsistency in the left-wing media, he says that the left-wing media will criticize right-wing nationalist people when they have anti-gay views, but they won't show up at Muslim conventions and criticize Muslims when they have anti-gay views. Well, I would like to throw that back at David Menzies and say, David Menzies, do you and Ezra Levant and your team at Rebel Media, do you show up at Christian conventions? Do you show up outside of the Canada Bible College when Charles McVety is speaking and condemn him for his anti-gay views? Do you ask the Christians who are attending those conferences about what they think about Charles McVety's anti-gay views? No, you don't do that. And that's what makes you a racist, because you give white people a free pass. They can be anti-homosexual and that's okay. Then it's just traditional Judeo-Christian values. Then it's just traditional Canadian values. But if a Muslim like me has anti-gay views, oh, then I'm not Canadian, then my lifestyle isn't compatible with the Canadian lifestyle. Even though my views on homosexuality would not be very different from yours or from that of your parents or your grandparents. I believe that homosexuality is wrong. But that's a far cry from a criminal action of calling for violence against gays or for inciting any kind of violence against the homosexual community. So no, you won't be standing outside of those conservative kind of conferences criticizing those people. You won't be standing outside because you'll be inside those conferences. Ezra Levant has met up with Charles McVety at the Canada Christian College. They have been speakers at the same stage, at the same platform. Here is an excerpt from one of your news reports, David Menzies, where you meet up with Charles McVety and you don't grill him and you don't ask him about his anti-homosexual, anti-transgender views.
Well, you never know who you're going to meet at a PC Ontario convention, and we have here our good old friend, Dr. Charles McVety.
So, David Menzies, not only do you not question Charles McVety about his anti-gay views, which you care so much about when you're talking about Muslim speakers at the RIS convention, but you even call him your good old friend. How did this homophobic character, this fellow who is anti-gay, become your good old friend? How did that happen? So this, my friends, is an example of the hypocrisy of the right wing, right? Just as the left wing is inconsistent, and I acknowledge that, the right wing is also inconsistent in how they decry Muslims and condemn Muslims, but they won't condemn Orthodox Jews or Christians for those same views. I'm sure that David Menzies interviewed young educated Muslims outside of the RIS conference who probably made these very same points, but none of that got published. None of that video footage made it to your YouTube channel. Instead, you only put up views of very soft Muslims who don't know how to speak, Muslims who don't speak English properly, or Muslims who simply don't know how to answer your very pointed questions.
But when it comes to someone actually advocating harm and death for members of the LGBT community, Well, if they're here, they must be invisible and silent.
Well, where did any of these speakers actually advocate harm or killing or harm or injury to the homosexual community? Where did Yasir Qadi or where did Omar Suleiman or any other of the speakers from that roster of speakers, where did they ever advocate harm towards the gay community? When did they actually say the homosexual community should be hurt or harmed or anything like this? In fact, all of these speakers advocate for the following of the laws of the land, because it's a well-known principle in the Sharia that you basically follow the laws of the land because you have an agreement. When you have an agreement, when you have a truce, when you have a contract, when you have a citizenship agreement, you have to fulfill the terms and the conditions of that agreement. So no Muslim in Canada that I know of, no prominent Muslim, no Muslim imam, no Muslim speaker in America or Canada is advocating for the harm of gays or homosexuals. So where did you get that from, David Menzies? In fact, using the very example that you gave of Omar Suleiman, what we actually find is the complete opposite. Why didn't you share this, for example? So in this tweet back in 2017, Sheikh Omar Suleiman says, here's point number 3. I also said if a person is guilty of actually committing the sin but does not change the religion to justify it, that does not negate their theological Islam. They would still be considered sinful Muslims, but Muslims nonetheless. This is standard Orthodox Sunni creed. And here's the important one, point number 4. Finally, I said that we should be unequivocal in condemning violence of any form against people on any basis, including orientation. Clearly, he means here their sexual orientation. I will stand with anyone targeted or abused, whether or not I agree with their theology or lifestyle. It's perfectly compatible, it's perfectly possible, at least in my world, in our world, it's possible that you can believe that something is wrong and you still don't have to advocate harm or injury of that group. You, after all, David Menzies, believe that Islam is an evil ideology. You've said that many, many times. Ezra Levant has said that Islam, radical Islam, by which you just mean Islam. You mean Islam based on the Quran. You mean Islam based on the Sunnah. You believe that that Islam, which you call radical Islam, is an evil ideology. So does it follow from that you are advocating harm and inciting harm or injury or killing of Muslims in Canada? It doesn't have to follow. So similarly, I can believe, Sheikh Yasir Qadi can believe, Sheikh Omar Suleiman can believe that not only is homosexuality evil, not only is it a sin, they can believe that it's a great evil. They can believe that it's even a spiritual disease. But that doesn't mean that they're advocating harm or killing. So this is the answer I would like to have seen from some of the young Muslims that were interviewed. But again, these kinds of media outlets, they specialize in targeting the people that they know are going to give them the kinds of wishy-washy, ambiguous answers or even wrong answers that they're desiring.
Now, we couldn't get access into this convention and film what is being said, but perhaps we can speak to some attendees who are entering and exiting the convention center and try to find out if these so-called distinguished speakers represent the kind of people you would think are good for reviving the Islamic spirit.
Now notice one thing, as much as these people accuse Muslims of being cunning and sleazy and deceptive and having a stealth agenda, this is more descriptive of these very same people. Notice how nice David Menzies is when he starts interviewing these young, unsuspecting Muslims. They don't know he's from a right-wing outlet, and this is a problem I'm going to come back to. But it's all very, very nice. They're always very, very nice. Hello, how are you? What brings you here to this conference?
You're here for the Reviving the Islamic Spirit?
Yeah.
Okay, then. And what are you hoping to get out of this conference, ma'am?
I think just how to become like a better person. Okay. After like a long year, it's always good to reflect on like yourself and like the things that you've been through. So this is a really good place to do that. It allows you to sort of take yourself out of context and analyze like what are the good things that you're doing and like how you can help other people. So that's essentially like what I come to this conference for.
Every now and then we just need to get our spirits up and revitalize that, Islamic nature we have. So
it's being reported that some of the speakers at the conference have very, I guess, repugnant views on women, Jews, homosexuals. Is that a concern to you, listening to some of those people?
I mean, I usually just listen to the speakers that I like,
Oh, okay.
so I go for them. Yeah.
Okay.
even if they have different views or not. I don't want to go into details because I'm not sure about that. It may be or may not be.
I'm sorry, I don't really know anything about that, and I can't really speak on it. I do have to go. Thank you so much.
So as you know, a lot of people have different views of Islam, but in my opinion, it's good to get a broad the whole spectrum of people. So let's get opinions from both sides.
I'm just wondering, how does that aid and abet reviving the Islamic speaker that the organizers would invite these kind of people to this conference, ma'am?
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah.
It may be view of the extremist, but those speakers, I don't think they are invited here to deliver in front of the large crowds.
And there are people here, guys, that are advocates of Sharia law. I'm wondering, do you think Sharia law is compatible with Canadian law and the Canadian Constitution?
Yes, I do.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yes, I do think it is.
So there comes the real question. You see, he kind of lures them in with all these nice, innocent questions. Then he gets to the real question that he wants to get to. And as Muslims, we have to wake up. We have to know who we're speaking to. Before you ever give an interview to anyone, know who he is. It's really not that difficult in the era of the internet. Everyone's got a smartphone. Ask him for his name. Look him up. Look up who is David Menzies. What media outlet are you from? Oh, Rebel Media. If you don't know what Rebel Media is, look it up. Because when you give interview to these people, they are only going to put the views that they want to put up. More than Rebel Media, really, I get frustrated by Muslims. Young Muslims should know who they're speaking to. Don't give interviews to haters. Refer them to the spokespeople at RIS. Refer them to the media spokesperson at RIS. Or if you know what you're talking about, if you know how to answer these very pointed, difficult questions, at least make your own video of that interview. Make up your own video so that you can upload the full conversation rather than just the 5-second clips that Rebel Media wants to upload. We have to get smarter than this, and we have to know who the main players are. Who are the main players in the anti-Islam scene in Toronto? If Ezra Levant, if David Menzies, if Katie Hopkins, if Eric Brazza, if these kinds of people, Blazing Catford, if these people turn up at our events, if they turn up at our conferences and they want to talk to us, we at least have to know who we're talking to. So please, brothers and sisters, don't give any interviews to these kinds of people, or if you know what you're talking about, if you're confident that you can handle it, make your own video and upload that to YouTube so that we can get the full conversation.